The waiter hesitated before letting me into the restaurant, not because the reservation was missing, but because of my clothes. I was wearing an old gray jacket, faded jeans, and shoes that had clearly seen better days. The place I was walking into, however, was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a quiet atmosphere where every table probably cost more than my entire outfit. "Sir," the waiter said politely, "this dining room is reserved for private investors tonight." I nodded calmly. "I know. My name is Julian Hayes, and technically, the dinner was being held because of me." Inside the restaurant, a long table had already been prepared for the executives of Redmont Technologies, a fast-growing startup currently searching for a $120 million investment. Tonight was their final pitch dinner with a group of potential investors. Except none of them had ever seen the main investor before. That part had been my idea. As I stepped into the room, several people at the table turned to look at me. The first reaction wasn't curiosity. It was confusion. One of the executives leaned toward the others and whispered something that made a few of them chuckle quietly. At the head of the table sat Victor Langley, Redmont's ambitious CEO. He looked me up and down slowly. "I think you're in the wrong room," he said. The table laughed. I glanced at the empty seat near the end of the table. "Is this where the investor dinner is?" I asked. Victor nodded. "Yes." Then he added with a smirk, "4 people investing in the company." A few more quiet laughs spread around the table. I pulled the chair out and sat down anyway. Victor frowned. "Excuse me," he said. "This seat is reserved." "For who?" I asked. "For Mr. Hayes." I picked up the menu calmly. "Good," I said. Victor blinked. "What?" I looked up. "That's me." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the laughter came back, louder this time. One of the board members wiped tears from his eyes. "Oh, that's a good one," he said. Victor shook his head, smiling politely like he was humoring a joke. "All right," he said. "Let's not waste everyone's time." He gestured toward the door. "Security will show you out." I didn't move. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a small black card on the table. Victor glanced down at it. Then his smile disappeared, because it wasn't a credit card. It was the founder access card issued only to one person connected to Redmont Technologies' investment deal, the person funding the entire company. Victor slowly picked up the card. He flipped it over. Then he read the engraved name. Julian Hayes, primary investor. The room went silent. Victor looked back up at me. His voice had completely changed. "You're Julian Hayes?" I nodded calmly. "Yes." Around the table, every executive suddenly looked like they wished they could rewind the last 2 minutes of their lives. And that was the moment the real dinner finally began. For several seconds, no one at the table moved. The same people who had been laughing moments earlier were now staring at me like they had suddenly discovered a completely different person sitting in front of them. Victor Langley still held the black access card in his hand, turning it slowly, as if the engraving might somehow change. "You're telling me," Victor said carefully, "that you're Julian Hayes?" I nodded once. "Yes." One of the board members cleared his throat nervously. "But we expected Mr. Hayes to arrive with the other investors." "I am the other investors," I replied calmly. That statement landed heavily across the table, because everyone in the tech industry knew the name Julian Hayes. I was known for something unusual. When I invested in companies, I didn't do it through committees or corporate funds. I used my own money. Victor slowly placed the card back on the table. "You could have told us who you were," he said. "I could have," I agreed. "But then I wouldn't have learned anything." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. "Learned what?" Victor asked. Leaned back in the chair and looked around the table. "Your first reaction to someone you believed had no money." No one laughed this time. The restaurant's soft piano music drifted through the background, making the silence feel even heavier. Victor tried to recover his confidence. "Well," he said with a forced smile, "first impressions can be misleading." "Yes," I said, "they usually are." One of the company's financial directors quickly changed the subject. "Mr. Hayes, we're very excited to present Redmont's growth strategy tonight." "I've already read your strategy," I replied. The man paused. Oh. Victor folded his hands on the table. Then you know the opportunity in front of us. I do. And, Victor asked carefully. I picked up the menu again. The technology is impressive. A few relieved smiles appeared around the table. Victor nodded confidently. Our engineers have been working on it for 3 years. I know. I placed the menu down slowly. Technology isn't the only thing investors evaluate. Victor frowned slightly. What else matters? I looked around the table. Again, people. The word felt heavier than the others, because everyone in the room suddenly understood what I was really talking about. Victor straightened in his chair. Are you suggesting our team isn't strong? I'm suggesting, I said calmly, that leadership matters more than ideas. Victor leaned forward. I built this company. That's true, I said. But I just watched how you treat someone you believed wasn't important. The board members avoided eye contact. Victor's jaw tightened. That was a misunderstanding. Maybe. I glanced at the black access card still sitting on the table. But misunderstandings reveal character. The financial director shifted in his seat. Mr. Hayes, surely one awkward moment won't affect a $120 million investment. I smiled slightly. It depends. Victor frowned. On what? I looked directly at him. On what happens next. Because the real reason I had shown up to dinner in old clothes. The company's technology was to test the people running it. So far, the results weren't looking very good. The table had gone completely quiet. A few minutes earlier, the executives from Redmont Technologies had been confident, relaxed, even amused. Now, every one of them sat a little straighter in their chairs, as if suddenly aware that every word they said could cost them millions of dollars. Victor Langley cleared his throat. Well, he said, forcing a polite smile, we're still here to discuss the future of the company. I nodded. Yes. Victor leaned forward slightly. So let's talk about the investment. Picked up my glass of water. Before we talk about money, I said let's talk about leadership. Victor's smile faded. What about it? I looked around the table. You have a strong product. Several executives nodded quickly. And your engineers clearly know what they're doing. More nods. Victor crossed his arms. So what's the problem? I took a slow sip of water. The problem, I said calmly, is how fragile. Your leadership structure is... One of the board members frowned. I don't understand. I looked directly at Victor. Companies collapse for one simple reason. Victor raised an eyebrow. And what reason is that? Ego? The word landed harder than anyone expected. Victor laughed once, but the sound was tense. You think I have an ego problem? I shrugged slightly. I think you laughed at someone who walked into your company dinner wearing old clothes. Victor didn't respond, because everyone at the table knew exactly what I meant. The financial director tried to step in. Mr. Hayes, I think what Victor meant earlier. I know exactly what he meant, I said calmly. The man stopped talking. Victor leaned back in his chair. So what now? He asked. I looked down at my phone for a moment, then I placed it on the table. What do you mean? Victor gestured toward the device. You keep checking that? Like you're waiting for something? I smiled faintly. I am. The executives exchanged confused looks. Victor frowned. Waiting for. What? I turned the phone so the screen faced the table. An email notification had just arrived. From Redmont Technologies. The subject line read, Board Approval, Emergency Executive Vote. Victor's eyes widened. What is that? I tapped the screen once and opened the message. Then I looked back at him. You told your board earlier today that this investment was already guaranteed. Victor's face went pale. How do you know that? I tilted my head slightly, so one of your board members forwarded the message to me. The entire table turned toward the directors sitting. At the far end, one of them looked like he wanted to disappear. Victor's voice dropped. That email was confidential. I nodded. Yes. Then I slid the phone across the table toward him. And now the board wants to know something. Victor stared. At the screen? What? I folded my hands calmly. They want to know if the CEO they're trusting with a $120 million investment, I paused, is the same man who mocked the person paying for it? And suddenly, the dinner meeting had turned into something very different. Victor Langley stared at the email on my phone like it might disappear if he looked away. Around the table, the Redmont executives had gone completely silent. The confident energy that filled the room at the beginning of dinner had vanished, replaced by something far less comfortable. Pressure. Victor slowly placed the phone back on the table. "This is ridiculous," he said. But the confidence in his voice was gone. I leaned back in my chair calmly. "Is it?" Victor ran a hand through his hair. "One awkward moment doesn't define a CEO?" "That's true," I agreed. Victor looked relieved for half a second, but I continued, "Patterns do." The board members at the far end of the table exchanged glances, Victor noticed. "Look," he said quickly, turning toward me. "I admit the situation earlier wasn't handled perfectly." I raised an eyebrow. That's a generous way to describe it. A few executives lowered their eyes. Victor exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said. "I made a bad first impression." I nodded. "That's honest." Victor leaned forward. "But you didn't come here just to judge how I greet strangers." "No," I replied. "Then what do you want?" he asked. I looked around the table one more time. Clarity. Victor frowned. "About what?" I pointed toward the executives sitting beside him. "These people are about to build a company that could be worth billions." No one argued with that. But companies don't collapse because of technology. I continued. They collapse because of leadership. Victor's voice grew sharper. "So what are you saying?" I reached for the black access card still sitting on the table and slid it slowly across the surface. "I'm saying the investment decision isn't the only one being made tonight." Victor's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" I stood up from my chair. "It means the board didn't just ask me to evaluate the company. Now everyone at the table was watching carefully. They asked me to evaluate you." Victor's face went pale. The director, who had been silent most of the night, finally spoke. "Mr. Langley, we discussed this earlier." Victor turned toward him. "You told me. The investment was the only thing on the agenda." The director shook his head slightly. "No," he glanced at me. "Told you Mr. Hayes would decide the future of Redmont Technologies." Victor slowly realized what that meant. His voice dropped. "You're not just deciding the investment." I shook my head. "No." Then I met his eyes. "I'm deciding the CEO." The silence in the room became absolute. Victor looked around the table. Some executives looked nervous. Others looked hopeful. Finally, he looked back at me. "So what's your decision?" Picked up my jacket. "The technology is brilliant." Victor waited, "and the team is talented." His hands tightened. "But leadership," I said calmly, "is about respect." I started walking toward the exit. Victor called after me. "Does that mean the investment is over?" I paused at the door. Without turning around, I answered. No, the room held its breath. "The investment is happening." A wave of relief spread across the table. Then I finished the sentence. "But the CEO?" I glanced back over my shoulder. "Someone will be announcing tomorrow?" Morning. And for the second time that evening, the entire room realized the man in old clothes had just changed everything.